In the last video I brought you, there was a hand where I got into a major jam, and I wanted to run it through a solver with you and talk it through. I promised you that I would. If you haven't seen it, it'll be in the description below. Go ahead and click that and feel free to give it a watch. That's a great session, by the way, super fun. Get pocket kings a bunch, get all kinds of cool things that happen. But this hand was probably the most difficult and the most interesting hand that I played all night. So we get pocket threes. There's a 3-bet in front of us from a very capable player. We end up making the call with pocket threes in hopes of flopping a set and then trying to get his whole stack. What happens instead is that we make the call, we go 3 ways to a flop, and the board comes deuce, deuce, deuce. So we've made a full house, but it's the worst one possible. So I went ahead and gave him this as a 3-bet range. This opponent is probably capable of getting even more out of line than this, but is a solid player. Like he's not just in there totally wild all the time, but definitely has the ability to maybe play with his range even a little bit more than this. But to give him a fair 3-bet range, I went ahead and went with these hands. So he bets 30 on the flop, and it comes to me. I've got pocket threes. You can see pocket threes is calling almost all the time, and that really I'm calling with all of my pocket pairs, and I'm calling with some of my best overcards. I'm folding all this middle stuff because it's pretty well dead, and occasionally if I happen to have quads, of course I am going to call. So I make the call, and we go to the turn, and the turn is the 4 of clubs. So now there is a flush draw that comes in, potential flush draw, but unlikely that a flush is going to be the best hand here. So he's going to be still betting with most of his range. 2/3 of his range is betting here. You can see that there's a lot of just overcards, generic overcards. He's got pocket pairs are all betting, which have us crushed. All right, so after he makes that bet, you can see that I am supposed to be calling with 2/3 of my range. And that's going to include a lot of these overcards and then all of my pocket pairs. Occasionally I have quads, but it's only one combination that actually does. This is where we're at. We're making a call on the turn most of the time. I actually thought I would be folding at a slightly higher frequency than this. I wasn't entirely sure at the moment. I thought maybe 75% of the time I'm holding on with threes, but it looks like about 90-95% of the time holding on with threes there to that bet of $80, because this 4, if he had overcards and was bluffing, the 4 really hasn't changed anything, which is what I stated in the video. So we were actually on point there. So the 4 doesn't change anything. I go ahead and make the call, and we go to the river, which is the Jack of Spades. And it gets a little bit interesting on this one. I gave it 2 options of the all-in or the 80% bet. He chose the 80% bet, and you can see that it chooses them evenly here. So it's choosing an overbet jam, a pretty large overbet jam, at the same frequency that it's choosing 80% pot. So I found that interesting. It makes sense. This is kind of the perfect board to do it, where I want to show you actually. So if he bets this amount, I'm going to be calling with threes at about 40% frequency, which at the time I wasn't entirely sure where I was at. I think on the video I said 25 to 50%. I wasn't really sure, but I knew that it was going to be at some frequency, somewhere around like 1/3 of the time. Anyway, so it turns out it's about 40% of the time. But if I go back on this and he jams, notice that it's going to take my threes down to basically a pure fold, and it probably would have pushed me out of that pot. I don't think I would have been looking at the time. What I ended up doing is I ended up looking for tells and feeling like I found one. Because it was so close, I made the call. If he overbet jams, it's going to be really hard. Even if I felt like I saw something, and when you're talking 1.5 times the pot, it suddenly becomes so much more difficult to make the call with those thinner hands. So anyway, so he does bet 224 rather than the overbet jam, and you can see that we're supposed to be calling with all of these, our highest pocket pairs at almost all the time, and then these at a much lower frequency. We're going to call the 4, which makes sense. So we're calling about 40% of the time. I end up making the call and it works out, but you can see how close this was and how easy it would have been to go either direction. I think either play is fine, to fold or to call, and the only reason I felt good enough to make the call was that I felt like I picked up on something before I saw what I thought was helpful information. My plan was to randomize, and if you've never done that before, basically what you're going to look for is you can take a watch and look at the second hand, whether it's even or odd. You can, maybe you choose, like, say you need to call 1/3 of the time. You can take a look at the second hand on your watch and say if it's 1 through 3, I'm calling. If it's above that, I'm going to fold. Something along those lines. And you can do that with a score of a basketball game, whatever you want to look at, but some kind of a Our brains aren't good at randomizing, so you need an external source that is indifferent to the situation to make that decision for you. So decide what the numbers are, so you basically determine what your frequency is, and then you're going to look for that random number to make your decision for you. That wraps this one up. Hope you found it helpful. If you want to watch a session video, I will link it right here. And if you are interested in something different, go ahead and give this a watch instead. Thanks for watching. See you next time.